everyone, and welcome to the SOLIDWORKS 22-minute webinar, The Real Cost of Mismanaged Data. My name is Barb Schmitz, and I'll be your host today. So let's get started. I'd like to introduce our speaker today. Mike Spence is an enthusiast of all things SOLIDWORKS and has been for nearly 20 years. He began his career designing ski lifts and developing product data management software, then spent many years deploying SOLIDWORKS PDM solutions with companies all over the West. He is currently a SOLIDWORKS technical manager. Mike, why don't you get us started?
As a brief introduction, I started my career in engineering as a print room clerk for a ski lift manufacturing company in Salt Lake City, Utah. Now, I spend most of my days filing paper drawings in filing cabinets and occasionally filing CAD files onto our server. Now, it wasn't the most tedious job I've ever had, but it definitely wasn't the best either. I really enjoyed the days when I could spend a little bit of time designing rather than just organizing content. Now, as I graduated as an engineer, I worked full-time designing, so I didn't have to at least file the paper drawings, but I still had those days when I had to take my design work and file it onto our server. Like many of us do, I had to move the old existing documents into an archive and bring in my files into the release directory. Now, that wasn't what I was hired to do. I wanted to design, and I was hired to design. But I had to spend that time to do the tedious work of managing the CAD files as well. So that's what I'd like to discuss today. We often spend too much time, and there's a cost involved in managing that data. So let's spend less time organizing our data and more time designing.
So let's come back to the topics that we'll cover. So in the next about 15 minutes, I want to talk about 4 key points. How SOLIDWORKS PDM can help you find your content, have intelligent, smart file management, keep changes easily, and have a full history of your design data. So let's start with that idea of finding it fast. You know, for those of you who spend most of your time, like I did, working over a network and file shares or on your local system, how much time do you spend every day just looking through file folders? If you haven't ever paid attention to that, just take that as an exercise today or tomorrow or when you have a moment to keep track of how much time you spend just doing that, just finding content. Not only that, but if we have an engineering change and it has a few drawing numbers written down on the engineering change, how do we go find those documents and make sure we can get to them? So let's take a quick look at SOLIDWORKS PDM and how that helps in the process. Now, one of the benefits right out the gate is that SOLIDWORKS PDM is still Windows File Explorer. So when I'm going to find things, if I'm more comfortable just browsing through folders to find files, great. No slowdown for me. I can still find what I want. You know, it's just Windows Explorer at this point. Double click on a file to be able to open it and work with it. But I also have other information available to me in the system. For example, I can preview many different file formats, including Excel, PDF, Word documents, SOLIDWORKS files, and other CAD files. But there's additional information stored and shared in cards that help us make sure it's the right content. Now, that's just browsing folders. How about we make this faster? Now, many of us tend to lean towards Windows search to try and find things, but on a network drive, how long does that take, right? Well, built right into SOLIDWORKS PDM is integrated searching, where if I know something about the part number, type in 227, and instantly comes up 2 documents in the system that have 227 in the number, both an assembly and a drawing. So that makes that quick and easy. Now with SOLIDWORKS files, of course, in the preview, we get full e-drawings previewing, so we get nice, rich viewing capabilities. Now, what if I know a little more about a document? For example, if I know, well, it's a Word document and it's got Scooter in the name. Well, I can fill out multiple fields in the search form and filter down on exactly what I want. And then the preview is going to, again, help me make sure I'm getting to the right document out of the results that I get. But even then, there may be times when you want to go back to the same information all the time. So if you run a search, you can always save it as a search favorite over here in the corner. For example, I might say, hey, let's look at all the pending engineering changes in my system. I don't have to know where these are at all, and with a quick search result, I get back engineering changes along with information about them, but of course here, easy to preview that. See, I'm supposed to rerun a simulation based on some material change. And just like a classic engineering change document, I've got the documents that reference, but instead of having to now search for those, SOLIDWORKS PDM also shows me contains and where used lists, so I can find, oh, this is the exact part that's been attached to this specific engineering change. So that's great. With a simple right click, I can just say browse to it, and it goes right to where that document is in my system. I don't have to know about it much at all, right? I don't have to know my folder structure, and there I am. So being able to find things quickly can really help save you time in the process. How about this idea of smart file management? What does that mean? Well, this is a message that none of us like to see. How many times have we gone in to open a SOLIDWORKS assembly or drawing and something can't be found? A part, a subassembly, you name it. Well, what's the cause, right? We try and do our best at making sure when we copy these files back over to the server or we move them around that we use SOLIDWORKS Explorer and that sort of thing to make sure all the references are updated. But, eventually somebody renames something or moves something and forgets to check for references, and we spend hours trying to find what it was that was lost. So what if we could completely get rid of that problem altogether? So let's, again, take a look at how SOLIDWORKS PDM helps you in this process, and think about what you do compared to how I'm going to do that in this case. Now, in my PDM vault here, I organize things by part number. Many of us do on our servers or on our local machines, but sometimes it makes it hard to tell what we're looking at. Well, notice I can also see descriptions, who's working on a document here. In fact, I have a few files that somebody else is working on. My user Dave in the system is working on these files. Well, this one is out of place. It doesn't have a part number as a file name. So what is that? Let's take a quick look. So it's a common shock absorber, and that should really be a purchase part. Maybe it doesn't belong here. So what if I were to rename it and move it? What impact would that have on my system? Well, with the Where Used tab, I know immediately that that's referencing 4 different assemblies in my system. It doesn't have to do a search to find those. It knows that in the database. So if I rename this assembly, I need to make sure those are corrected, right? Well, it's as easy as this. I'm just going to steal a part number from my data card and rename this just like I would in Windows Explorer. All the references behind the scenes are updated because this is like SOLIDWORKS File Explorer, Windows File Explorer with a SOLIDWORKS brain. Okay? And in fact, if I decide that's not really the right place for this file, fine. Just cut. And I'm going to move to a library folder in my system. And in fact, I've got my shared design library here that all my SOLIDWORKS users reference for assemblies, and these are my common assemblies, and I'm just going to paste it there. Now, in just doing this, just like I would in Windows Explorer, if I look at the Where Used list, all of those assemblies still know that it's referencing that new part number. And in fact, if I just double-click on one of these to open it up in SOLIDWORKS, we'll verify. Of not being able to find the file. That's a little bit of a rhetorical question, right? Of course not. It's smart. Behind the scenes, everything is getting managed. So no more warnings or errors about missing file references. That shock absorber now is the new part number that we can see both from SOLIDWORKS PDM inside of SOLIDWORKS and in the SOLIDWORKS feature tree. So that's great. That's helped save us a tremendous amount of time just worrying about file management. How about keeping design changes? If we have concepts that we want to keep, what do you do today? I've seen many customers, and usually it boils down to something like this. And this is what I used to do in the past as well. We create folders, and as we work on an idea, we throw, hey, our version 1 into one folder. And then we make some other changes. Maybe we make another version 2 folder. And then we make some more changes in a version 3 folder if we want to preserve these. Because these may not just be a progression of a design. It may actually be changes that we want to show. We want to show these in a design review board and say, what about this idea, or what about this idea? So we need to keep them, but then managing that with the assembly that it belongs to. How many of you, and this is again a bit rhetorical, use pack and go and then collect everything together and throw it into a zip package? Well, that's great, except imagine all the copies of fasteners and common parts and parts that didn't change that we're zipping up every time and multiplying our storage. Well, again, let's take a look at SOLIDWORKS PDM and how it helps us in this process. Now I'm going to focus on this little subassembly here. And let's open that up because I want to work on some design changes to the sprocket. So SOLIDWORKS PDM and keeping changes is all based around an idea of check-in and check-out. So if I decided I want to put my name on this assembly so that I can make changes to it, I can do that right from SOLIDWORKS, or I can do it in File Explorer as well. But this is showing me a list of files that reference this, this assembly, including the drawing. That's a good reminder. I probably ought to check out that assembly drawing while I'm at it. Okay. So now my name goes on those documents. And let's also do the same with this part. As I'm working, I can decide, oh, I want to make a change to this sprocket. So I can also get to that from a simple right-click menu. If I want to right-click on a file to get it checked out, put my name on it so it assigns the changes to me. And since many of us are SOLIDWORKS users, I'm going to do some changes with just a quick little easy bake. I've got a couple ideas. I want to keep some round holes. And so instead of thinking of saving this to a folder, going to Save As or Pack and Go, I'm going to do a simple check-in operation. And I'm going to keep that assigned to me for a minute, but put some notes in here that relate to my change. I added some round holes, right? And what it's doing behind the scenes is giving me another copy of this file. So let's try a different concept as well. I think we could do a better job lightening up this component if we do some slotted holes. So let's preserve that concept and put in a note that I added slotted holes. Okay, now the benefit is that instead of worrying about folders, I'm dealing with the same part number right now, and I've not gotten to an official revision. These are just concepts. But I have all of that available to me on the fly through the user interface. Okay, here's my version 2 where I added round holes. And you can see that change in the SOLIDWORKS interface. Sorry to jump around a little bit. There's my round hole version, as well as my original version. And I can get to all of those just with the click of a mouse. Now that's great as well at the assembly level. You know, imagine sitting in a design review board. If we want to talk about lightening up this chain sprocket, or the whole design for that matter, I can look at all those versions from the SOLIDWORKS PDM user interface as well. We can say, okay, we came up with this idea to add round holes, and that lightened the assembly, especially that component. And my latest version gets it even lighter, down to 0.57 pounds. And I think we still have the strength to make sure this design is appropriate. So, you know, imagine being able to do that without having to worry about any file folders or saving copies or pack and go to be able to preserve those. And now I can move this on and mark it with a revision if I'm ready to go. In fact, let's go ahead and get it checked in and finalized so I preserve the history at the assembly level too. And just like the checkout dialog, it reminds me, oh, you have a drawing, that should be checked in as well, and that's true. Updated the sprocket. And behind the scenes, the system knows who did it, when they did it, and of course the changes that we're making are all preserved for us. So that's how SOLIDWORKS PDM can help us keep those changes easily with a simple check-in and check-out process. Now, how about a full history? We've been building a history as I've gone along. Every check-in operation builds that. But how does it work in use? Here's a really common case, especially if you're doing any sustaining engineering that can be a tremendous value. Say we build an assembly, a simple example in this case, and we release it as revision A. Okay? Then we make some design changes, and later down the road, well, before we do that, we sell this to a customer. They have revision A of the assembly. Now later, we decide, oh, you know, we can make this better. We make revision B of the assembly and the parts, and now this is what we sell to current customers. And in fact, we have spare parts available of revision B, just in case we need them. Now, the first customer that bought our revision A assembly comes back to us and says, "Ooh, we've got a problem. This part broke, bent. We need a replacement. It wore out." But they have revision A of the assembly. Can we send them the revision B part that's on the shelf? And can we see that? Can we look at it and see what it looks like without a lot of effort? Well, that can be tough without having to go back to ERP systems, BOMs, you name it, to try and figure out, okay, will this work? Well, let's see how SOLIDWORKS PDM helps you tackle that problem. And in fact, let's focus on Windows Explorer for just a moment. Now, coming at this from a design standpoint, I know this has, I know in the description, this assembly I'm looking for has mount in the description. Well, okay, this is more typical, right? We search for mount and we've got a lot of results, Word documents, PDFs, all kinds of information. Well, I also know that this is a released file. So I can go to workflow settings where we can stage things in different points of their life, right? Well, now I have two assemblies that filters down to. Boom mount. Now that sounds familiar, and this is our Rev B released assembly. Okay, so I can preview that. Yep, that's the one we want. Now before I get into this too far, again, I can just with a right click jump right to the folder and the project where that file actually resides if I'd like. That'll give me a little bigger preview. Now what I wanted to emphasize in that history, not only do we have a visual list of all of the history available for who did what and when it happened and any notes they added in, but I can get to that. So for example, the same thing I did in SOLIDWORKS, I can come in Windows Explorer and say, well, what did this look like at Rev A? Because this has been a long time ago. I don't even remember what this thing looked like. Behind the scenes, the server for SOLIDWORKS PDM sends us all of the files that were used at Rev A. So everything on my local hard drive now is exactly what Rev A contained. This was an old welded version of this backplate. Well, can we replace that old welded version with the new forged version? Will that work? Well, let's take a look in SOLIDWORKS and at this assembly so we can see if we can make that decision and send them the forged version. And I'll basically use the same process we used just a few minutes ago. Okay, so this is the Rev A of the entire assembly. This is exactly as it was built. And I can see this backplate is an older version, but just like I did before, I can go to my reference list here of my list of history and say, let's just look at Rev B of that backplate while we're still looking at Rev A of the assembly itself. Now it looks okay, but SOLIDWORKS gives us some great tools like hole alignment checking. So we can check for any misaligned holes with this new backplate. Okay, there are no misaligned holes. That's a good thing. Maybe some interference detection. And we'd like to dump all of our fasteners into a bucket because there's probably going to be some, thread interference in there. That's expected. And no interferences other than simple thread interferences. Of course, we'd want to evaluate this closely for any other concerns that you might have in sending this replacement part to a customer. But that makes a fantastic way to be able to evaluate what you might send out and if it's actually a valid replacement. So imagine the time savings and being able to do that right from within SOLIDWORKS and Windows Explorer on the fly to see what was done in the past and if new parts are interchangeable. So giving you that full history. So we've touched on the history, being able to keep that version change easily instead of having to use things like pack and go, the smart file management where you can rename and move files around without breaking file references, and being able to search and move through file folders that are already familiar to be able to find your documents fast. And that really helps reduce that cost of mismanaged data. Because after all, we don't want to spend time organizing our files. We want to spend more time designing. And that's really the key with SOLIDWORKS PDM.